On July 24, 1969, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins triumphantly returned from the most important mission ever accomplished in human history. They have just been on the moon. They are the first human beings to have ever visited another celestial body and to have safely returned from it. On the recovery ship, they are welcomed by President Nixon in person.
Hello and welcome to our today's video. Today we'll be discussing the reason why NASA never returned to the moon after the Apollo missions in the 1970s. Here's a bit of a background. NASA executed the Apollo program, a human spaceflight program that aimed to be the first to land humans on the moon. This program was conceived in 1960 but was successful between 1968 to 1972. Apollo was dedicated to President John F. Kennedy's national goal for the 1960s of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. It took 6 missions to land 12 astronauts on the moon that conducted various studies and discovered unique areas of the lunar surface, starting with Apollo 8, which sent the first crewed mission to the moon and entered orbit around the moon with a 4-minute burn. Unfortunately, it could only complete 10 orbits of the moon before returning to Earth in 1968. Then, on 18 May 1969, a trial for Apollo 11 was conducted, known as Apollo 10, in which 2 astronauts on board descended to a distance above the lunar surface. Afterward, finally, the world witnessed what they had never seen before. In July 1969, Apollo 11 successfully fulfilled the goals set by President John F. Kennedy, and Neil Armstrong became the first human to set foot on the moon. A few missions later, the last one was witnessed in December 1972, known as Apollo 17. It's now been 50 years since this last successful mission, which made us wonder, why did NASA stop? Post-1972, most of the Apollo programs were shelved except the space station's Skylab. Instead, the remaining Apollo rockets and spacecraft were used to establish 2 programs, Skylab and the Apollo-Soyuz test project. And the idea behind Skylab was to have an experimental home in space. Thus, it was the first American space station built from the 3rd stage of a Saturn V. The cost of these Apollo programs was estimated to be $20 million in 1973. As we know, NASA receives its funding from the annual federal budget passed by the United States Congress. So one of the main reasons for the closure of the Apollo programs in 1972 was that Congress reduced its funds. For the United States, the Apollo program was an expensive undertaking, and initially the idea behind going to the moon was to show the world, especially the Soviet Union, what the United States was capable of in terms of technology. However, later this competitive spirit started diminishing, eliminating the strategic need to fund NASA. And there were other areas as well that were at a higher priority and needed a large share of funds, such as the Vietnam War. Secondly, it was reported that after Apollo 11, public interest in space also started declining. In their 1997 book Spaceflight and the Myth of Presidential Leadership, space historians Roger D. Launius and Howard E. McCurdy emphasized the fact that Apollo was born out of a special circumstance. And this is true because, as we mentioned earlier, U.S. President John F. Kennedy was only worried about Soviet military expertise, specifically pursuing the space program and the moon landings as one of the country's main policies. As Jim Bridenstine, the former NASA administrator, said, it was the political risks that prevented it from happening. The program took too long and it costs too much money. Well, actually, funding was not the sole reason behind the curtailment of the mission. But actually, there's more to the story. NASA also changed its priorities as time went on, and it started working on projects that focused on other things rather than the exploration of the moon. The Space Shuttle, a system of partially reusable low-Earth orbital spacecraft that was in use from 1981 to 2011, was one such initiative that diverted their focus from Apollo. Additionally, NASA worked on a number of space station designs that ultimately led to its participation in the International Space Station, ISS, whose initial components were launched in 1998. NASA, United States, Roscosmos, Russia, JAXA, Japan, ESA, Europe, and CSA were the 5 participating space agencies collaborating with each other for the ISS. The Apollo-Soyuz test project also held great importance. This is because, after years of bitter conflict, the United States and the Soviet Union launched their first joint space mission to highlight the decline in global tensions. The United States would use its Apollo spacecraft that had been designed for the Apollo lunar missions, while the Soviet Union would use its Soyuz spacecraft that was used to ferry cosmonauts to its Salyut space stations. And both of these vehicles used very different and incompatible docking hatches. NASA created and built a unique docking module to function as an airlock and transfer corridor between the 2 craft to solve this issue. This project served as a sign of the two nations improving ties in July 1975. And during their several days in orbit together, the crews worked on various jobs, visited each other's ships, and shared meals. The problem also lies within the Constitution, or in easier words, with the presidents. It's common for newly elected presidents and parliament to abandon the preceding leader's ambitions for space exploration frequently. One such example can be taken from 2004 when NASA was asked to come up with a replacement for the space shuttle by the Bush administration. The agency introduced a rocket called Ares and a spaceship called Orion for the Constellation program that would land astronauts on the moon. NASA spent $9 billion over 5 years designing, building, and testing hardware for that human spaceflight program. However, when Barack Obama became the president, he canceled the program and approved the SLS rocket in its place because NASA's inability to predict Constellation's cost was detailed in a report by the Government Accountability Office. Following him, when Trump came into power, he didn't scrap SLS, but his aims were different. Unlike Obama, he didn't want to launch astronauts to an asteroid, so he shifted priorities to the moon and Mars. These recurring changes definitely come with a cost, which is an expensive one. Constant changes in priorities have led to many cancellations, resulting in a loss of about $20 billion, along with years of time and momentum being wasted. This constant political battle over NASA's mission and low budget is part of the other reasons why people haven't returned to the moon. Another problem is that the moon is becoming like a death trap for humans. We often hear the term moon dust, but not many people know that it's actually sticky. The surface of the airless moon is continuously blasted by the solar wind, which charges the fine-grained dust or regolith. Everything the astronauts touch, including their boots, gloves, suits, wires, tools, and more, becomes coated in lunar regolith due to this charge. Apollo missions had a lot of problems with dust, according to astronaut Peggy Whitson, who spent a lot of days in space. If we're going to spend long durations and build permanent habitats, we have to figure out how to handle that, Whitson said. Other than that, from the environment's point of view, things are pretty harsh there as well. The moon has no atmosphere to shield it from the sun's fierce rays. Thus, for around 14 days at a time, the lunar surface is a boiling hellscape. However, the next 14 days are in total darkness, and the surface is one of the colder places in the universe. NASA has created rovers and spacesuits that are resistant to dust and sunlight to address these problems, but it is still unclear whether this technology is even close to being ready for launch. We now have the reasons in front of us, but does this mean that we should be expecting NASA never ever returning to the moon? Well, according to NASA, US astronauts will definitely return to the moon soon, possibly by 2025 at the earliest, as part of a program called Artemis, which would also feature the first woman to ever set foot on the moon. So just with an ample amount of resources, humans will be back to discovering much more and revealing the untold. We just need to sit back and wait for it to happen.